Hello and welcome to the Quarter Horse Hauler with Ryan Fleetwood. Today we have the distinct honor of being with Dr. Wayne Burwash in his home, and we're going to do a bit of an interview with Dr. Burwash. And so I'd like to introduce you to him at this point. He's sitting here with me, and Dr. Burwash has been an influence and an inspiration to many of us in the quarter horse business and in the horse business. I think that a lot of people watching will recognize your name today, Doc. And for those that don't, we'd just like you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your past and your history and yourself.
You know, I started out, and my dad loved horses, even though I grew up on a dairy farm. And so, you know, and we were a rodeo family, and so that was the start of it. And then as I got older, and after I graduated from veterinary college, we were more involved, or got involved in the quarter horse business. My ex-wife, my first wife, was very horsey too, and so we had horses, and I went and interned at Kansas State University, and we actually picked up a couple of horses there too. And then, so in the 70s then, and this was all back in 1970 is when I come back from Kansas and started veterinary practice here in Calgary. And so we had some horses, and we're never quite sure what direction to go, but we had a horse, this J-Bar Dolly horse, who was a kilobar, King Leobar, granddaughter King Leobar. And so that was the first really good horse that we had in the family. And she turned out to be a great reining horse, working cow horse. And so that really initially pointed the direction for me in the breeding program, was wanting to do the cow horse. And back in the 70s, it was interesting. The working cow horse was really got to be very popular, and it's come back again just recently. But
yeah, safe to say that as a quarter horse man, you have seen a lot of changes through the years.
Oh, yeah, that's for sure. When I started, and again, my focus has been more narrow even though I was a rodeo person to start with, but, once I started horse showing, then that was the focus. So we never did have the quarter horse racing bloodlines at all. It was more the all around. And so, through starting in the 80s right through till, after 2010, 2012, 13, the whole breeding program here was focused on the all-around horse. Mm-hmm. Horses that were heavy enough muscle to halter some, really focused on good conformation, and then of course some athletic ability, and we all wanted pretty horses, and so a whole mix so that we could halter and do all the performance events. And so,
do you think, Wayne, that a lot of all-around type horses exist anymore?
Well, they do, yes. I don't see the focus near as much now on the all-around horse. Like, it seemed like, and maybe I was narrow, and I was a Canadian and just, working more locally. So I think most people back in the 80s and 90s, for sure, were more focused on an all-around horse, especially for the horse shows. Mm-hmm. There was for sure the reiners and the cutters and that, and of course the team penners and that really became popular then. And there was always the team ropers and the barrel racers, which of course is now huge too. So, but yes, I think we saw a lot more of the all-around horse, whereas that's sort of evolved, and probably because the competition got tougher in all these various disciplines, that a person had to really focus on that to be competitive and to win, I guess, more than be competitive. You wanted to be a winner. And so that's where we saw the involvement, So I can look back and think, well, when we had the cow horses, a 15 one-hand horse was a good size.
Right.
And now, more recently, just because of the bloodlines and what I happen to be producing and what started winning, because I always liked a bigger free-moving horse. So now my breeding program, and I must say I haven't got a big breeding program. I got 2 brood mares, but I'm focused on trying to produce a hunt seat horse.
Right.
So now I'm looking at a 16 to 17 hand horse, a big, more thoroughbred type of horse, a big free moving horse.
Yeah.
So, interesting to have an evolving, depending on, to a certain extent, what the horses were good at when started showing, and then you of course go on from there and focus on that.
Form to function. And
yeah.
Also interesting because in contrast to the more cow horse type of horses or those disciplines, then we're looking at those horses overall getting shorter and shorter.
Well, yeah, the cutters are smaller and closer to the ground, of course. But, the cow horses are, I don't know, maybe a bit bigger than they used to be. My one daughter-in-law is really into cow horse, and so she probably doesn't like a horse that's 16 hands, but still is strong in the 15-hand range.
Right. Yeah. And in fact, the beginning of our involvement together was when I finally got up the nerve to call Dr. Wayne Burwash and ask if perhaps I could bring a stallion here to stand. Right. And that was when you and I first met. And you were very kind and very gracious to an utter no one, who was me, calling you to see if we could perhaps bring a stallion here.
So was that after 2000? How long ago was that?
Oh my gosh,
20 years ago?
Yeah, it has to be that long ago. Yeah. I think that it would have been Jazz Poco Golden Blue who came here first. Oh, yeah, right. And then we had Simply a Spark here one season. Yeah, so we had a real range of studs, and we had a lot of them come in to be collected to ship semen and freeze semen. We got into the freezing, and then we started doing embryos back in the 80s too, and they were kind of unheard of in the horse business then. And they were really getting hold in the cattle business. And so we started doing embryos back in the 80s, even embryo transfers, before most others were.
So, the breeding was always a real challenge and really exciting for me. And so that was my passion, I guess. I liked all of veterinary medicine, but the breeding was really my big thing. And
So, Doc, what would you say, with a specific focus on the overall health of the animal, has been a change that you've seen perhaps from the beginning of your career to now?
I don't think the horses are nearly as sound now as they used to be. And maybe that's good for the horse or the veterinary business, because it means a lot more horses require veterinary attention to keep them sound and keep them going. But, back in the 70s and 80s, it seemed like we, really were campaigning horses fairly hard and training and maybe not traveling the miles that we do now, but yet we didn't seem to have to do that much with them to keep them sound. Whereas now, and I think it's an evolution of how we're selecting of horses, where and there's lots of discussion now about trying to change the industry, but it's sort of evolved where the futurities in the quarter horse business, whether it be reining, cutting, cow horse, pleasure, whatever, or even now the lunge line, so we're asking more of these horses at a younger age. And that's probably not good for them. They sure aren't mature. Their bones aren't mature. Their joints are not mature. And so I like to kind of compare them in our selection process with the warm bloods. The warm bloods, the Grand Prix horses in dressage and jumping often were teenagers, but they barely get them started under saddle till 3 or 4. And, like the jumpers, which I do a lot of FEI jumping shows, they hardly do much jumping till they're 7. So they bring them on very, very slowly, and so they're still good. And so the real top horses are, like I said, were often teenagers, and whereas the quarter horse business, and almost regardless of the discipline, if we're looking at competitive horses anyhow, the focus is on younger ones. So we push these horses for the 2-year-old pleasure classes, for the futurities, the 3-year-old cutting futurities, reining futurities, you name it. And what happens is that these horses that win those big events, of course, are highly promoted, and often they are retired to the breeding shed if they're stallions, or mares to be in a brood mare. And so they don't have to have the longevity in their soundness. If they're sound enough to make it there, then that's all they need. And so who knows?
And often retired before they reach physical maturity.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're just aren't even 4 years old yet.
Yeah. Could you take us through, in some layman's terms, the physical maturity process of a horse and when they are actually mature?
Well, yeah, and there isn't a distinct time. We know that the growth plates are all mostly closed. The growth plates in the bone, where the bones are growing, they close. The growth plates are cartilage, and so that's where the growth of the length and the diameter of the bones come from. And so all the growth plates are pretty well closed in the horse by the time they're about 27, 28 months old. So before they're 3 years old, anyhow. And there's different maturity times, but that's probably the average one we talk about in the quarter horse. The Arabians tend to be, if I want to compare breeds, they tend to be a little bit slower maturing. But anyhow, so the quarter horse is really not, as far as bone development, mature until then. But you still, even beyond then, you still have a maturation process of the muscles and ligaments and tendons and everything that, so, we shouldn't really be pushing these horses that much. And again, if I circle back to the lunge line, we are working these horses as yearlings. And the other thing is we're working them in a circle, which probably isn't the best thing to be doing with them either.
Right.
And so we really got to be guarded about overdoing them in a circle, lunging them in a circle.
Right.
Because that tends to be that constant turning, whether it's one way or another, is harder on the joints. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, I think the horses generally are not near as sound. The other interesting thing I just thinking is that now, and again, personally, I used to always like to really have a good look at the stallions I'm breeding to. At first, back in the 80s, I had my own stallions, but since the early 90s, I've always bred two outside stallions, and I used to really be critical. But now with all the ship semen and frozen semen, I'm breeding to some horses that I haven't even seen. Right. I see pictures of them in videos, but so I really don't know the confirmation. But that look or that presence in the show ring, and again, I'm just talking about showing. It's different than race horses or team roping or the rodeo horses where they just got to get the job done. Mm-hmm. But even reiners and cutters got to look good while they're doing it.
Absolutely.
And so I think that I know if I want to compete on a world scale, and I'm trying with my breeding program to go beyond being just competitive locally, and if I get a really good horse, then I want to hit the big shows in the U.S. and like the NSBA World Show and the AQHA World Show. Yeah. And so I know that I have to have a certain look if I want a hunt seat horse now, or a hunter under saddle horse, or a Western pleasure horse, or but even the reiners have to have that look, and sure. And so and again, I maybe shouldn't be admitting this, but I've probably sacrificed some confirmation for sure, but also I'm seeing my own horses as not being as sound as they used to be. Again, because the focus is on that look and maybe a shorter longevity. For sure when I was breeding for an amateur horse where Shannon would show and maybe want to ride for say 5 to 10 years even, you got to have a horse that's going to stay sound. Whereas with the futurities now, like I'm geared to wanting to produce a horse that may be a really good 3-year-old hunter under saddle prospect, and then market them if they're really successful.
Yeah. So, Dr. Burwash, would you say then, in conversation about the fact that all of us tend to ship semen on horses and breed to stallions that we perhaps never actually seen and looked at, that some of the soundness changes over the years have come about because we're not maybe doing a full exploration of what some of these horses are that we're breeding to?
Yeah, no, for sure. Because I've looked at stallions. I see a lot of horses, and I go to the big horse shows like the World Show and that, and I see horses that stallions, particularly, is what I'm looking at because I got my own mares, and there's some that are really winning a lot and are great in the show ring, and yet you look at them and they'll have possibly a major conformational fault. And so then I'll discount them as a stallion, or I sure want to pick a stallion that is particularly strong in an area where, say, my mares are weak. And so, but there again, because of the promotion in that and the potential of the value that it got a popular bloodline, and I think you appreciate, Ryan, that the bloodlines get kind of narrow in a lot of the disciplines, and if you aren't breeding to that bloodline, then you kind of sacrifice the marketability, or not maybe the market. The marketability as well as the price you get for them. Yeah. And so I'm finding myself being, I don't know if I can say I'm forced to, but if I want to be successful, both in the sense of having that look in the show ring, as well as being marketable, then I gotta be mostly with a popular bloodline that has that look and that movement, whether it's a Hunter under saddle or the Western Pleasure,
whatever the goal is,
or the reining. If I was reining, you get fads in the show ring, or I maybe shouldn't call them fads, but trends in the show ring, and you got to be in that trend to win,
right?
And in the judge classes, I mean, I think oftentimes, maybe a person should be just raising race horses or barrel horses or team roping horses, where it all just
where there's something more objective.
Yeah, when it's all time, so. It doesn't matter how fancy. Well, everybody likes a nice horse, but a barrel horse, if whoever gets across the finish line first.
Right. There's nobody's judgment affecting the outcome.
Yeah.
Right. It's just the timing.
Yeah.
I always find it interesting that we are involved in a breed that evolved to become the biggest breed registry in the world in a short time, really, based on the versatility of the horse. And now we have this market that's very discipline specific and pursuing it almost exclusively only that way. Don't you?
Well, yeah. And I often think of it as maybe a testimony to how versatile the quarter horse was, I guess, because, we used to, and as I've talked earlier, I was breeding a horse that could do it all, hopefully, and mostly as an amateur or a youth horse, but yet, they would show open too. But now, as we selectively breed, we're selecting the expertise or the movement and that look and everything of the different disciplines. And the quarter horse has evolved where they can do all these things. So you've got the Hunter under saddle that may be 17 hands tall as a 2-year-old, which is maybe a little bit too big in my mind, but yet for sure they're huge. And yet at the other end of the spectrum, and I pick on the cutting horse probably as being the ones that tend to be the smaller, and again by selection, where they're the best horses for that discipline. They may not even be hardly 14 hands tall, some of them. Some of the world champions are that small. So in that respect, they could be called a pony by anybody else's standards. But so it's amazing how through, again, you mentioned a short time of our breed becoming the most popular breed in the world. Like in Canada now, a quarter of all the horses in Canada are quarter horses. And there's, So, and it's a relatively young breed, where we aren't even 100 years old yet. What did it start back in the 1940s?
Early 40s, yeah.
So here we are, and again, a testimony to the versatility of them and the adaptability and probably the biggest thing I see is the temperament. The quarter horse, that's where they shine still, regardless of whether you've got the Hunter under saddle, the bigger thoroughbred type horse, or they got that disposition and that trainability that everybody loves. And and amateurs and real novice people can take a horse and have a good horse and really enjoy it. So I think as much as, like you say, we've got away from the traditional versatile quarter horse, but yet we've got it in a lot bigger spectrum where we got the versatile, but the specialists in all these different areas. And, it takes a specialist to win now because the competition is so tough that, you just can't take an average moving horse and win on a world scale. So,
yeah, good perspective for sure. And I'm thinking about how we could get into a conversation about conformation and the conformation of horses, the athletic ability and what athletic ability is, and, you know, discipline specific breeding versus breeding for a more recreational market, etc. But all of that is overshadowed by what you said. If we don't have disposition, we have nothing. Yeah. It doesn't matter about the rest of the horse, because if they don't have the mind and, you know, if they're not trainable and willing, the rest of it doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah. And regardless of whether you're a super world-class trainer or a real novice recreation rider, you're right. We all want that disposition.
And I think it's an appropriate time to talk about the numbers. You know, the AQHA's own numbers show 12 to 15% of people ever setting foot inside a competition ring, which means that when we have, let's say, an 80% plus industry market that is made up of recreational members, whatever it is that they want to do with their horses, then we have to remember to focus on the recreational rider.
Yeah.
So,
well, and almost regardless of the discipline, most of them wind up exactly there in that market of being a recreation horse.
Yeah.
You know, whether a lawn ornament for somebody who just loves to have a horse and maybe go out and pet it, or, you know, get on 2 or 3 times a year and on a weekend and go for a bit of a ride. But for sure, the recreation, the non-competitive horses, or the non-competitive riders that have a recreation horse, you know, some of them, they need a really sound horse too, and they'll ride a lot and cover a pile of miles, probably more than the show people if we compare it with the people that are really into competition. And so I think, well, getting back to the disposition, everybody needs that. And everybody needs a sound horse. It's just that, you know, the recreation horse tends to, maybe doesn't have to be a sound to be serviceably sound.
Yes.
And we use that a lot in veterinary medicine, where there's a difference between a horse being outright 100% sound and whether any of the horses are truly that versus serviceably sound. And obviously, if you're just going to walk and jog on a trail, a horse doesn't have to be as sound as a horse that's going to be a high-performance reiner or a cutter or something.
Indeed. Doc, if we circle around again to the general soundness and the changes that you've seen over your years involved in the horse business, would it be fair for me to say that the soundness of horses today, the expectation of soundness of horses today, is carried by the veterinary industry as opposed to expected from the breeders and what they're creating?
For sure, the veterinary business has got a lot bigger role to play. I don't know if you can say they're the main factor in that, but for sure we see horses that are 2 and 3 years old that need a lot of maintenance of their joints and everything to keep them sound.
And sorry to interject here, but did you see that when you were early on in your practice as much?
No. So in that sense, for sure, the veterinarians have played a bigger and bigger role. And you know, it's great for the veterinary business, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
You know, you have a lot of unsound horses that you need to say, you know, simply inject joints or whatever. You know, it's a whole package. I think now we do a lot more preventative stuff than we used to, just because we're smarter. And of course, we've got the diagnostic equipment, all the digital x-rays and digital ultrasounds and all the technology, the lasers and everything, and the shock wave to treat. But for the diagnostic things, we can pick up a lot more subtle things, and then there's a real tendency to want to do our best to counteract that being a degenerative thing, or slow the degenerative process if it may be going to happen. Try to keep these horses sounder longer. So I think there's definitely a combination there of us picking up a lot more very subtle changes that we get worried about, versus, again, earlier in my career where, particularly if I talk about x-rays, I mean, not even going to MRIs and bone scans and that, which are more specific and really pick up very, very subtle changes. But even just simply x-rays were, even when I started my career, at the end of the 60s, we x-rayed, but the quality of our x-ray was nothing like it is now. So, but, now inherent in a lot of our bloodlines or a lot of our horses are all this degenerative joint disease, OCD. And for sure, there's a lot more of that than there used to be. And we can pick up a lot more subtle changes, too, than we used to be able to. So we get a double whammy sort of thing where we really are seeing a lot more serious problems there, but also picking up a lot more problems that we would never pick up in the past. Yeah.
So this might not be an answerable question, but why? Why is that occurring more now than it used to?
Well, and it's a selection process. Like I think you look back at the old ranchers, and of course I'm not that old, but the breeding used to be a real selection process on these ranches where if these horses weren't sound, they wouldn't breed them, and they would soon be out of the herd. Whereas now, what we see, and here again, the veterinary profession is a big factor there, and I don't know if we can say the veterinary profession is to blame for it, but if we have a horse that's been a real winner, regardless of the discipline, then we do all kinds of things to keep them going. So again, they have maybe a longer competitive career, and also the next step, if they go into the breeding program, and of course, there again, you don't have to be sound. If you've done good and you made $1 million or something, then say a stallion, everybody flocks to him, and he might not be terribly sound, but but if they, and again, back to wanting that winner and the popular bloodlines to market, people flock to those horses to breed to, and then you get a whole new generation of horses, if that horse wasn't very sound, of being unsound. And so then I think it's snowballed a little bit, where we see horses that would never been bred in the past now are, well, in some cases, leading the industry.
So, Dr. Burwash, what would you give to someone as advice who is listening to this podcast and thinking about breeding their mare or mares at this point in history, at this point in the world? What advice would you give them to look at in that stallion when they go either to look at him, or if they can't look at him, what should they ask to see?
Yeah. Well, if you can't look at him, or if you don't go see him and see him perform, see him move even, then it's really hard to evaluate. And then you're mostly looking at black type sort of thing. And of course, we've kind of evolved to that, like the race industry was forever, where if a horse had a good career and had what they call a lot of black type in a program, then they were sought after because they made a lot of money. And
empirical evidence.
Yeah. And so that's is more and more the gauge now in most of the disciplines in the quarter horse. And so, but if you're just starting, I guess you got to decide where you're going to go. Obviously, we get back to the disposition. And I think back in the 80s in Alberta here, we had that horse improvement program that we had a true form to function that Dr. Beeman from Colorado kind of coined the term. And that was a great teaching tool for people that they could learn about conformation and they learn about free movement. And so we don't have that anymore. And so, again, it depends on the person's what they want to do with a horse.
Yes.
And where they're going to go or at what level they want to go.
Yeah.
You know, you get a lot of people that are say, going to get in the breeding business that haven't really been horsemen. And that's another thing that just popped in my mind. I think we have a lot of people that are in the breeding business that really don't know conformation, have grew up in an era where they don't appreciate, and I shouldn't categorize everybody or paint everybody with the same brush, but yet I see a lot of the newer people in the industry accept these unsoundnesses as a normal, whereas I don't, because I started in an era where a lot of these unsoundnesses weren't in the industry. But now it's more accepted that you're going to have these things and you deal with it. And so I think the industry or the breed has deteriorated because of that, because you don't have the selection that we used to have. Or again, if I compare to a lot of the warm bloods, where again, maybe a good example, and I don't want to be too critical of the quarter horse, but interesting how things evolved in the breeding business. Like, we'll get a lot better conception rates with frozen semen from warm blood horses as a general rule, and they all are individuals, versus the quarter horses. And again, that's largely because the warm bloods have been selected for fertility with frozen semen for a number of generations now, whereas it's a relatively new thing with the quarter horse industry. So again, it's really interesting how we can select and go in a direction relatively quickly in some ways. And getting back to the versatility of the quarter horse, how we can go and whether it's good or bad. In some cases it's been bad. But in other cases now we've the very top horses in all these disciplines are exceptional as far as their athletic ability or their look, or if you're talking to halter horses or whatever. So there's the good and the bad of that.
Well, I suppose with any domestic animal or any breed of horse where people are making the selection process, it would depend on how people are predominantly making that selection process, what direction it goes in, which is part of what I'm continually always thinking about and talking about in the discipline-specific choosing mating process, right? Choosing of mates. Again, not that I think that it's necessarily a bad thing, but I just want everyone to know that that isn't the only way to make a selection process. And I think that's what we're talking about today, that you have to be sure and look past just the evidence you can see on paper, whether that gives a horse value or not.
Yeah, and it for sure isn't the only thing, So again, getting back to your question a while ago is, what do they look at? I'd like to think they again look at the disposition and the conformation and the movement, and then the black type. But I think the performance record, or Stallion, if you're choosing a Stallion, his production record, and that's so important. And that's the bottom line with most Stallions as it evolve. They could be a superstar in the competition, but that doesn't make them necessarily a sire where they're going to be prepotent in producing what they were with crosses with different mares. And so and there again, you'll see a lot of disciplines will have a certain bloodline that becomes very dominant.
Or 2 or 3.
So,
the selection process for mating decisions has to involve more than just black type pedigree and earnings on paper. In order to keep the longevity and the soundness and what made our breed what it was in the beginning, which was its ability to be versatile. So Dr. Burwash, one more thing I want to ask you about. We've talked about a number of the considerations for selection process when making mating decisions, in obviously disposition being top of the board, conformation, their movement, their black type pedigree, their earnings, etc. And then one of the other things that's pretty popular in this day and age in the stock horse business, the quarter horse industry, for sure, is the 5-panel and now 6-panel testing. And I know that you are and have been in the past a member of Stud Book and Registration Committee that considers all of these types of things coming into the AQHA and what rules will be instituted and how. So what is your take on the genetic diseases and, just how, how much consideration should be given to those things in the selection process for choosing matings?
Well, very important, depending on the genetic defect or genetic irregularity. The first one, then the one everybody knows about, is the HYPP. And of course, it's the example of the AQHA not getting it identified because it was entirely new, and there was a great reluctance because those horses were winning at halter mostly of trying to slow down or select against it, I guess, because it was almost necessary to be producing winners. And so, but yeah, it's very important. Like the Herda now, the other, maybe, I don't know if I call it the major one, but the one that's can be deathly. So definitely, if you've got a horse that is got one, maybe back up in that, I don't know if most people understand that there's 2 genes for every trait. So, well, it's not that simple, but anyhow.
It's fine. Simple is good. Yeah.
And so for these genetic diseases to be fully expressed, most of them, you need the 2 genes to be the ones that are defective. And so, the Herda, which is where the skin, it just loses its elasticity and will tear off. If a horse has just got one of those genes, they totally normal. but you sure don't want to breed that horse to another herd, because then you run the risk of at least 1 in 4 times of getting a horse that's got both the genes defective and then a wasted horse. And so yes, it definitely it is very, very important to be looking at these things. And this is where the quarter horse, they get a lot of negative thoughts about the breed, because it looks like, because we're identifying 6 and testing for 6, that, gee, this breed's really got a lot of trouble. Well, the quarter horse has been an industry leader in finding these genes and identifying them so that we can use a good selection process in our breeding, and the other breeds don't tend to do that.
Right. It's being proactive.
Yeah, we're being very proactive, and so it makes us look a little bad as a breed. The American quarter horse is a breed, but it's a good thing, because there again we can select what we don't want and or what we can live with.
Yeah, people can put a spin on it to make it look bad because the breed has all of these genetic defects that they're looking at. But the truth is that the breed association has been proactive in identifying them and testing for them and making stallion testing mandatory so that everybody is on equal ground when it comes to using that as part of their selection process to make mating decisions.
Yeah. No, and that's so important. And so, as you say, for the breed association, the breed registry, to identify that and have regulations about requiring that is so good for the breed. Yeah.
I wish that there was a way, or maybe it's coming, that we could test genetically for OCD, parrot mouth, cryptorchidism, things like that, so that it was verifiable. But I always find it interesting. There's kind of 2 camps that you see out there: people who don't give any credit to the genetic testing, that it's just an AQHA money grab, which I don't believe.
No, definitely not.
And then there are others who say that this needs to be at the top of your selection process, which I also don't believe.
Well, it depends on what, like if you have a herd of horse, one that's not HN, but Herda N.
One copy.
Then it has to, and in a breeding program, it has to be number 1, because you definitely, doesn't matter about the performance record, the production record, the disposition, doesn't matter about any of those things if that horse has also got one Herda gene.
Right. So I should further qualify my statement in saying that I don't think it should be the top priority in the selection process. It needs to be part of the priority in the selection process. And for me personally, I've come to a place where I've decided that I can't live with a stallion who's a carrier of any of the things that are verifiable for us, because they create multiple offspring per year, typically, whereas a mare, typically, not always, is creating 1 per year. And so I can forgive her a recessive genetic disease that she's only going to pass on 50% of the time. And if it's a colt, we cut him. It's not a big deal, right? But for me, I want to look at stallions that are clear of those things so that I'm not propagating it in multiplication numbers.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. Like, I could never live with a stallion that has 1 defect, that he's not NN right across the board. Because you're mating that horse with so many different mares.
Right.
And so if that stallion has got some defect that's identified, then that really limits the number of mares that he should be crossed with. Whereas a mare, you can live with maybe a number of genetic defects, but just choose your right stud.
Right.
And you're, like you say, you only got 1 well, unless you do a bunch of embryos, but
Yes.
you've really only got one individual to be concerned about, that mare, whereas with the stallion, you might be concerned with, 20 or 50, or like some of these studs, they're breeding 200 mares a year.
400.
They're 400.
Yes.
And, then it becomes really critical.
And that isn't to say that, I don't want somebody coming at me and saying, hey, are you saying that we should have never bred metallic cat or highbrow cat or some of those horses that are herd carriers? And that's not what I'm saying. But I just think that we need to be very careful about the selection process and which of those offspring perhaps are used to go on with and continue to propagate.
Yeah. And, how do you... be overly critical? Well, we are critical, all right, but if a horse is producing, again, a stallion is producing all kinds of winners, then it's hard to be too negative about that horse, and again, if you just select the right mares to...
Right. And then the resulting right offspring after that. Yeah. I could not advocate for a total cessation of breeding any horse that's a carrier, because there's so many great horses out there that are. Yeah. But certainly we can concentrate on going forward with the horses that are not carriers of those genetic diseases as we look to the future. Yeah. So lots of things for us to think about when we're making breeding decisions, for you to think about in your program, and me and mine, and everybody else who's doing the breeding as well. Yeah. Dr. Burwash, we talked a little bit about your involvement with the AQHA. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, how long you've been involved, the different committees that you've been on?
Well, I, of course, was involved locally with the Alberta affiliate of the AQHA, back in the 70s and 80s even. And during the 80s was the time when we had the Alberta Quarter Horse Breeders Group, which was huge. And we started exporting horses to Europe. And so we largely got the quarter horse into Europe. There really weren't many there. And so we, through the 80s and into the early 90s, before the Americans got going on it, we were the main exporter of horses into Europe. Mm-hmm. And so that was my first really big involvement, where I was the president of the breeders group here. And so we had major shipments of horses going overseas then. But as far as, so that's more of a local thing. As far as the AQHA, Shannon was a director first, and I don't know, she got in around 2000 or something, I think. And so then I was elected as a director in 2011, I think it was, and that was, I was on the stud book committee for a year or two before I was a director, and then since I became a director, I've been on the stud book and registration committee mostly, but also spent a number of years on the research committee. Mm-hmm. So they're both excellent committees, and there again, the AQHA is very proactive in financing and supporting a lot of really good research. Yeah. So there's, I don't know, depending on the year and the success of investments, but we were looking at supporting $300,000 to, I think, up to over $600,000 worth of research a year. So again, the AQHA has been excellent in so many things for the whole horse industry, not just the quarter horse breed. And so, I got to applaud them. They get a lot of really negative feedback, I think, a lot of times, just because they're so big and powerful. But yet they've earned that position, and they continue being proactive enough in so many ways to do the quarter horse good, but also all breeds,
Yes,
all horses, nutrition, disease prevention and control, whatever. And so,
indeed.
yeah.
Yeah. Would you encourage people who are maybe listening to us visit today to get involved with the AQHA and, at a policy level, to come to convention, those kinds of things?
Well, yeah, for sure. Like at the convention, they've got one day that's largely an educational day. And so that's got to be interesting to people that want to learn things. As far as the policy goes and making rules and regulations, I guess that I don't look at that as being something that the average person would really get turned on with. I think there's where you're a more serious breeder or competing in any of a number of the disciplines, and it doesn't even have to be an AQHA approved discipline. You get a lot of the barrel racers or the team ropers, and I don't mean to pick on them, but they got huge competitions and just for weekend jackpots. And so, the soundness and the regulations of the breed are important to them, but yet I don't see them really getting that involved a lot of times,
But for someone who's interested in being involved, would you encourage them to come to convention and, not only that part, but talking about the networking opportunities and just the ability to meet people and learn things outside of your normal parameters of your thought process, etc. There's no end to it, in my opinion.
No, I totally agree. And there's the social thing too, beyond the education and the stimulation of learning things, is that, so many very, very interesting people that you meet. And I through breeding, not just going to the convention, but there's so many good people in the horse industry that, you meet in your breeding program or in the showing or through my veterinary practice. I just look at so many good people that I would have never met or become friends with or whatever if it wasn't for the horse. And,
Agreed.
Yeah.
Hence the reason we're sitting here having this visit today.
Right.
Yeah. Doc, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit. You've mentioned a number of times your late wife, Shannon, and I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about her influence on your life and perhaps the education sponsorship that you do in her name and how important that is.
Well, Shannon and I were, of course, number one, our whole life revolved around the horse, both me professionally as well as our raising of horses and showing and that. So, but, so much of the horse industry we found was built on anecdotal things and folklore. And so we both we both saw how doors open by being educated. And so we were both very strong advocates of kids getting a post-secondary education. And, it doesn't have to be university, but something to open their eyes and teach them how to think and be more worldly. And so that was a real big thing that Shannon and I thought of, and because of a lot of the industry, the horse industry, didn't seem to be based as much on science and good solid fact. We need leaders that know things and will be leaders in the horse industry. So that's when Shannon passed away. I just thought, well, this was such a big thing for her to have people get an education, number one, be a horsey person, but get an education, and hopefully through the scholarship program that we've established, that we'll have new people coming in the horse industry that'll eventually be leaders in the horse industry that have a good solid education, and we can build the selection process. We've talked mostly today about the breeding and everything, and how a lot of it really hasn't maybe got as much of a good scientific analysis, if we can do that at all. But anyhow, so that's what the scholarship program is for young students who are horse oriented, that have decent academics, but not necessarily, but show leadership qualities, show volunteerism, and hopefully will turn out to be the leaders in the horse industry that we need to keep it going. Because I think the horse industry is shrinking somewhat, and that's largely because people are moving away from farming and agriculture. We get, 3 and 4 generations of people that are urbanites, and so they don't have that association with the horse and the land and grassroots and that. And I guess I'd like to get back to that a little bit too.
So can you give listeners an idea of where to go to find out about that that sponsorship? Well,
this scholarship fund is administered through the Calgary Foundation, and so they do all the it isn't really advertised, but they do all the administrative stuff to get it out to all the industries, all the colleges, the universities, right from like Olds College or any of the veterinary tech colleges, the veterinary schools, the agriculture schools right across Canada. And the scholarship fund is strictly for Canadian students. And we got 2 levels, where the one level is for students that are just starting in post-secondary education, and then another set of 2 scholarships for students that are more advanced. And so
that's great. It's a great scholarship opportunity. So if anybody wants to look for it, they can look for it under the Shannon Burwash Memorial Scholarship.
So all the universities and colleges should have it listed in their lists. But if you go on the Calgary Foundation website, then it's there for sure.
I have a quick story, and it involves you, of course. And one of the first conventions that I went to, I remember we went to a social, and I just ran into you, and you said, "Come with me, I'll introduce you to some people." And one of the people you introduced me to was Dr. Glenn Blodgett from the 4-6s. And, the rest of my story is that I just remember standing there, listening to the 2 of you visit, and thinking, in what other opportunity in the world would I have to try and gain knowledge from Dr. Burwash and Dr. Blodgett, except at the AQHA convention? So that is a standout memory for me. And I've said to you before, Wayne, but I'll say it again. I want to thank you for everything that you've done for me, all the times you've brought me along, all the times you've straightened me out.
Well, no, I don't think so.
And I also really want to thank you for agreeing to do this today.
No, you're very welcome. And I hope that it helps. I don't know, I probably rambled on a lot, but anyhow, that's some of my ideas. And getting back to the convention, when you talk about Dr. Blodgett, that's a prime example of people going and just being around and start to talk to people, and you get to meet so many really interesting, very wise people, and
Indeed.
And you can learn so much. But just the social thing is fun too. And of course, that's
It is.
the bottom line with everything. We got to enjoy life and have fun and
develop friendships and relationships.
Yeah.
And speaking of being around wise and knowledgeable people, that's how I feel when I'm around you.
well, I'm not
So,
sure.
Well, no, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
but,
I'm sure. Dr. Burwash, is there anything else that you would like to talk about? Or
Okay.
I'm going to say thank you very much, Dr. Burwash,
you're
for
very
being on the
welcome.
Quarter Horse Hauler. And you are our first interview ever. You have always been in my mind since I started thinking about doing a podcast. With your knowledge and your life experience as a quarter horse horseman, I really appreciate your time and your energy to be on here.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you and Shannon, both of you, for all of your contributions to the industry and all of those things. So that is the conclusion of the interview with Dr. Wayne Burwash, and thank you for listening to the Quarter Horse Hauler. This is just going to be our second episode, or at least it's only the second time we've recorded. There'll be more coming your way. I want you to know that we have secured agreement for interviews with some really great trainers. One is Josh Nickel. Another is Jonathan Field, and another is a guy that some of you may know by the name of Al Dunning. So we've got some great things coming your way. We're sure looking forward to the future. And if you'd like to reach me, it's ryan@fleetwoodfarms.com. Email me at ryan@fleetwoodfarms.com. As always, I remain what's committed to the best for the breed.